Hello everyone, welcome to Shelf Life with Midday. Today we have with us Kurush Dalal, a very well-known archaeologist and food anthropologist from Mumbai who is also known for chronicling everyday food stories in a very interesting manner. We get a chance to look at what goes into his library and also to know more about how reading has shaped his interests in food, archaeology and everything that concerns the evolution of this city.
I started reading early. I come from a typical Bombay middle class family. In the 70s, things were not as easy as they are today. The middle class was not as moneyed as it is today. So, when you said I want, the answer was no. The only time I want, the answer was yes, as far as my parents were concerned, is when it was books. So, when we asked for books, it was never a no. To the best of their abilities, parents would try to ensure that there were books. Books were birthday presents from my parents, from my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. So books were a complete part and parcel of life. In the early days, there were either the kind of documentary books. Tell Me Why was a series. There were various series. I was very interested in space. When I was a little boy, I wanted to be an astronaut. So I had a lot of beautiful colored books on space and what could happen and what could not. My mother was a very, very avid archaeologist and historian. So automatically a lot of history and archaeology was part and parcel of growing up. There were these lovely little ladybird books, there used to be hard-covered books, but small books for children. And we had quite a few of those at home also. And they were passed on generation to generation. So I read them, my cousins read them, they came back home for my brother and sister and that kind of thing. Not always. The books didn't always come back. Some of them met with fatal accidents in their lives, but one took a lot of care of this. I went to boarding school in Panchgani. We had a beautiful library. Interestingly, that's where I first really started reading science fiction because there was a small selection of very good science fiction novels over there. Plus, our principal loved reading and they would buy a lot of fiction and then they would donate it to the library. So all the latest fiction as such was hitting the library. So through my 8th, 9th and 10th, I read a lot of thrillers. Again, I wonder sometimes whether, it was a little early for them. There was also a very good collection of things like Camus, Kafka, and I switched over to reading a lot of Westerns. So I went through an entire spate when I devoured Western novels, J.T. Edson's, Louis L'Amour's, Max Brand, and myriad other authors, Luke Short. Very, very typical early days of reading Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and thinking that they were the whole world of science fiction as such. And then slowly reading people like Larry Niven and realizing there was an entire world out there. And then the kind of journey was endless. I went to college in Bombay. One of the places that throughout my life we frequented was Strand Bookstall. So Strand Bookstall and Shanbag Uncle was, he was Shanbag Uncle to my mother. And we've got beautiful stories in our family about him. My mother must have spent lakhs of rupees over the years over there. When I bought one of my first few very serious books, which is quite tattered now, and it's called The History of Architecture in India by Christopher Tagel. It's one of the great books on Indian architecture for beginners. I went to Deccan College, I did my archaeology, I bought Deccan College publications, some of which I was very lucky to buy, which I'm told are no longer available today. Some of which I bought to do research with, so that I could have my own copy, not the copies in the library. So one of the books over there is this one over here. So this is the excavation report of a site called Navada. It is a Bronze Age site and it's a fabulous report written by H.D. Sakali. It's one of his classic reports. And I remember going to the publications department at Deccan College to buy something completely different and realizing there was a copy available and immediately snatching it up. Now, the good thing about university publications and college publications is that they still sell them at the price at which they were first issued. So, you can sometimes 40, 50 years down the line find a book that is 20 rupees, 17 rupees. And you laugh at it today, But that's because it was published and that was the price demarcated and that is the price at which it will be sold. And I had bookshops that I knew, second-hand bookshops all over Bombay. One of my favorites was New and Second-Hand Bookstall, which sadly doesn't exist any longer in Kalbadevi. and opposite the famous bar called Sunlight. And it used to be this treasure trove of old books. All the bookshops in the good old days at what we call Fountain. So the footpaths of Fountain were littered with bookshops. CTO, all bookshops. On the other side, opposite the CTO, we had outside of the High Court, all bookshops. Across the road, the entire corner where the Dada Nauroji statue is, on both sides were just bookshops, and the CTO bookshops also wrapped around the CTO. Sadly, most of them all of them on the CTO side and the High Court side are gone. They're still there across the road, wrapped around Dada Nauroji's statue, as I say, and a lot of them really know their books. There used to be a gorgeous fiction second-hand bookseller in line with Dreamland Cinema. So on Churney Road, opposite Railway Bakery, on the corner, there used to be an old man who used to sell books. Fabulous books. You could also give them back and get 50% back, or you could keep them for yourself. I think more often than not, I never returned these books. I suspect that me and my wife together, between us, own at least about 2,000 books, if not more. Someday, I'll get one of my students to actually sit and count them. But till that day, that's a process.
One common ground between the two of us that joined us books-wise was my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law and I shared a lot of book interests. We both loved reading Mills and Boonish romances, and more than the modern ones, we liked authors like Georgette Heyer, who wrote historical romances, and I have all her books. My mother-in-law and I shared a great love for those books, and unusually, Kurush likes to love those books also, and he's read most of them. Since Kurush and I were both in Deccan College in Pune studying archaeology, it's but natural that both of us have an interest for archaeology, and we spent many hours in the library over there. That library is fantastic, and like all students, you aspire to own a few of those books, especially the good books, the textbooks and things like that. So a part of our collection, our common collection, comes from there. And as far as non-study interests are concerned, once the internet happened and once social media happened, I think you're just bombarded with books and information about books. There are forums about books, and whether it's about the subjects I like or the subjects he likes, there's information from everywhere. Whenever I see something that I think will interest him, I either buy it from him, because Amazon the Great is now, very much a part of our lives. And otherwise, I'll send him a link and ask him if, he would like to have this book. Now, on his last birthday, some of our friends messaged me to ask what should we buy him, and most of them were sure that books would be the answer.
Keep it properly always. Preferably have shelves. Make sure that the walls that you put your books against don't have seepage and leakage. Use mothballs. Never mind if your room smells like mothballs, but please use mothballs. It makes a lot of difference, because moths and silverfish and things like that eat into books over time. And if you mothball your books, they stay very, very well. Don't pull out books by putting your finger over here. Hold the book from its sides and pull it out. When you pull out a book, pull it out like this. Don't yank it from here. When you yank it from here, it tears. And once this binding tears, then it's all the way down. It's going to end. So the life of your book, is in your hands. You get to decide. This is something else that a lot of people, I think, who will read a lot will tell you, that they very often read multiple books. You're not reading one book. So just now I'm rereading Lords of the Deccan by Anirudh Kanisetti. This is a really beautiful book, very, very historically accurate, and surprisingly easy to read. It's not just for the academic. And all of these books from here onwards were given to me for my birthday. So I'm going through them one at a time. Some of them are hilarious. Some of them are very serious. This one is virtually a story of alcohol in India. So I haven't even opened the plastic on it. So I'm really looking forward to it, because the second book that I've seen This is a lovely book on the domestication of the horse. I had this on my bucket list on Amazon, saying, "Ye kharidna hai," and somebody gave it to me for my birthday, and I was so. Students of mine have been very kind to me. You buy books also, uh, and you. So there's a really, really fun, lovely book, which is actually a translation of a Gujarati book of a man who went to war from India. So this is Nariman Karkaria's book. It's his memoirs of the First World War, and was written in Gujarati originally. And Murali, who I know personally at the Asiatic Society, translated this book, and it's a fabulous book. My mum was a great cook. Okay, good cooks can be trained, great cooks are born. And if people are offended by this, I'm sorry. We had very, very interesting books on food when I was growing up, which my mother would buy because she would use them to study. It wasn't so much about cooking something from it. It was reading about different culinary traditions, trying to get into the head of the people who were cooking and understand why this kind of food versus that kind of food. What are the things that bring a cuisine together? So early on, I realized this from my mom that people were reading recipe books for the recipe. Okay, theek hai bhai, I want to make something, I'll read a recipe book. She was reading a recipe book to understand the mind of the author and the culture of the author through their food writing. So when she started writing books, and she wrote a whole series of books, 6 of them, on food, her books had stories in them along with recipes. She talked about her family, she talked about the Parsis. Her first book, Chamba Chaloji, I think has gone through 5 or 6 reprints. It's virtually the book in every Parsi woman's trousseau in the last 25 years. Every community has a book like that. So the Parsis have had 2, 3 books, one after the other. And it's interesting to see when you start putting community-based books together from one community and seeing the trajectory, where it's going, what the influences are. And you realize that it's a lot of hard work. In India, very, very rare people do culinary anthropology. Very few people really do food history as such. Nobody had ever called it the archaeology of food. Nobody had looked at it as food comprehensively, So bringing all these things together after 20 years of doing archaeology, everything fell into place. We've had more than 400 people come and study food with us online. I haven't looked back over there. We have a huge food library now, mainly recipe books, some books on food. There are beautiful books available on the anthropology of food. There are beautiful books available on the history of food. There are great Bibles of food which you should not buy unless you're very serious about it. And a lot of people end up buying and not realizing what to do with it. Is something called the Larousse Gastronomique. This is the Bible of French food as such, and of a lot of European and American food. So there isn't yet really a book on the history of food in Mumbai. There are books which deal with food in Mumbai, but there is no such book that deals with the history of Mumbai's food. So there are a number of very good food writers. I've met some fabulous bloggers over the years who blog about their food and who write about it. And they write about their communities, they write about their families. And ultimately, that's what food is about, no? Food is not just a list of ingredients and how to put them together. There is a lot of heart, a lot of soul. I keep telling people who want to read about food that there is an online portal called the Goya Journal. There's a lovely book on Indian food, which is very easy to read and factually very correct. I know because I fact-checked a lot of it. It's called Who Moved My Samosa by Sonal Ved. It's a nice book on the history of Indian food. Could it be better? Could it have more? That's always, it could have more. But I think for a start, this is a book that we've been waiting for a very long time. There are people like Pushpesh Pant, who was the backbone behind Jigs Kalra's books. When Jigs Kalra wrote his famous book Prasad, he was the man who wrote with Jigs Kalra, and all of us remember Jigs Kalra and we don't remember Pushpesh Pant. He's a civics man and his knowledge of food is extraordinary. There's Dr. Mosina Mukadam, who taught history all these years and retired just recently from Roya College, and is perhaps the only PhD I know, serious PhD on food in India and food history. So, there are brilliant people like that. I could probably name 100 different people who write on different communities and their food, and they don't pretend to know everything. They don't write about Greek food today, Australian food tomorrow, Venezuelan food day after and write all three things as though they are experts. Because nobody can be an expert on all those things. But when you write about the food of your community and then you publish on the food of your community, then those are books really worth reading. Rupa Nabar's book is just out on the GSB community. Brilliant book. Sometime before that, Smita Dev wrote her book on, her entire journey of food from Kolhapur to Karwar. And that itself is another fabulous book. So there are some very good books on food that are being written. Today, the online repository is a repository which can be accessed by millions of people. And the kind of audiences that are willing to interact, today's youth want smaller doses of interaction with a lot of visuals. Is reading dead? No, it will never be dead. I mean, this is the original database. I don't think there's any way it can go away. But it is becoming more and more digital. So digital reading is now becoming much, much more common than it ever was. So, aisa nahi to vaisa, reading will be there. To put it in a very simple nutshell, my mum told me years and years ago that if I loved to cook and I loved to read, I'd never be hungry and never be alone in my life. And that's, I tell you, I honestly think is one of the great quotes of my lifetime. That if you love to read, if you learn to love to read, and you can teach yourself to love to read, you'll never be lonely. As long as you have a book, the whole world can go to hell.
Subscribe to Midday India. Get direct notifications on all our videos by clicking on the bell icon.